Hello everyone. My name is Dr. P.P. Berge. I'm an assistant professor of experimental game design at the University of Alberta. I hope you're all doing well over there in Austria, and I'm glad to be joining you from here in Edmonton, Canada, where it is probably about 2 in the morning at the moment, so please do forgive me if I end up being a little sleepy at the Q&A. I'm really glad to be sharing with you all my paper today titled Anti-Games, Fantasy Consoles, and the Rise of Speculative Game Development on itch.io. There's a lot of content in the paper that I can't cover in the talk, but I'm going to do my best to hit the key highlights. So this study contends with the practices of what I'm calling speculative game design, which I'm defining as the creation of game projects which are conceptual, arbitrary, and which cannot, either materially or procedurally, be played. These are games that cannot or should not be played, consoles with no circuits or breadboards or drives. Speculative games require that we engage these works via other means. We cannot play them, so we must imagine them, read them, not play them, and create with and from them. On itch, speculative game design communities are flourishing. Dozens of makers join up in experimental jams to build, solicit, and circulate anti-games that refuse to be played. At the same time, fantasy console developers shape their creative practice around fictive and hypothetical hardware systems. These impossible creations are more than trivial gags or niche creative challenges. As I argue here, indie game developers are turning to the speculative in their practice as a means of resisting corporate encroachment and reactionary subcultural movements within gaming culture. They are building games outside, quote, the inconveniences of playability, material hardware, and game culture. But beginning around 2020 and coinciding with the rise of analog game communities and digital game ecosystems, jammers and zinesters on itch have increasingly turned toward speculative game design in their practice, as illustrated by a growing number of anti-game jams. I'm using the term anti-game here to clarify that these are projects which resist and or reject ludic interpretation or engagement at all. They are games that are not games. Anti-games exist in proximity to lyric games and game poems, and they're rooted in speculative practice, and I see them as part of an ongoing artistic movement interested in the unplayable as a space for radical design. To give an example, in April of 2024, game writer Snow facilitated the Lost, Broken, Unplayable Jam, a month-long event that tasked participants with submitting all the lost, broken, and unplayable ideas, everything discarded, unfinished, dreamt but never written, Word docs rusting in a dust-laden folder, mostly empty journals with doodles and notes. Put them here, Snow said. The rules for the jam specified that the project submitted must be titled, could be in any format, and that Snow wanted all participants to make at least one unplayable game. I want this to be the pit where we cast these magic PDFs, TXTs, Google Docs, MP3s, comics, and HTMLs, the pit that bubbles and boils and churns, and that we can all drink from and gather inspiration. Now, the Lost, Broken, Unplayable Jam garnered nearly 70 submissions, which included unfinished demos and autopsies of game drafts that were never finished, spells, rituals, guides for transformation, and even a fictionalized blog post about a scrapped role-playing video game called Sitzprobe Assemblage. Some of these projects were unplayable in that they simply do not run or are incomplete, while others refuse, muddy, or terminate play in other ways. For example, Null, submitted by Thriftomancer, is intended to be used while one plays another game, and includes a single roll table, with each possible roll of the dice selecting a different game component, such as the resolution mechanic or the inventory, that must be removed from the other game moving forward. To play Null, then, one must not play, or ideally remove from play, the components of other games. Several other submissions to the Lost, Broken, and Unplayable Jam warn would-be players not to engage with their submissions at all. A Ritual to Open a Gate to Hell Inside Your Mind, by Personable, is a role-playing game that forbids the would-be player from playing it. The text of the game begins, "This is a game. Do not play it. This is not a game. You must play it. Perform the ritual. You must never perform the ritual. Snow's own submission to the jam, titled Teeth, provides guidelines for biting and bandaging one's romantic partner due to lycanthropy, and similarly forbids actual play. Snow describes Teeth as a game you should never play with your loved ones, the band-aids in your apartment, and sharp teeth. Now, the Lost Broken Unplayable Jam is only the most recent installment in this tradition of anti-game jams. In November and December of 2020, Monkey's Paw Games hosted the Art is Ego Jam, which explicitly noted that participants should make a thoughtful piece with unplayable mechanics. Do it in an hour or less. Don't, under any circumstances, play test it. And submissions to the Art is Ego Jam include Jim is kind of cool's This is not art, this is a product, a one-page Word document priced at $30 US, but for which 10,000 free community copies were made available. This is not art, this is a product contains a few vague rules for RPG character creation, but then specifies that any other rules about how to facilitate the game belong in other products. And Jim is Kind of Cool is not the only participant in the jam whose work serves as a commentary on the financial landscape of making playful media art. J.N. Butler's The Waiting, a role-playing game submitted to the jam, is, as of this writing, priced at $500 US. In the description for the project, Butler notes that some have shared that they think this game is not worth $3, even though I offer community copies for free and the preview image contains the whole game. I agree it's not worth $3. It's now worth $500, so give me a half K or get it for free. Either way, stop complaining about people charging for their work. In this same vein, from April to June of 2021, itch user Red hosted a small jam called Jam Without Numbers, which told would-be participants that the jam is dedicated to the parts of games that aren't games. I want this to be permission to just write, and not have to make it gameable. Make whatever you want, but it can't be a mechanic, a random table, a stat block, nothing that's part of a game. And the projects submitted to the jam include found text fiction, pages of a spellbook, poems, recordings of dreams brought on by PTSD, a Google Photos album of found text, and a recipe for spicy cabbage, which the author claims is neither a game, nor is it a recipe for kimchi. The Jam Without Numbers then created a game jam wherein any Demakes system was forbidden, opening space for designers to contribute mixed media art of all kinds. Now, these jams exemplify a growing trend in itch game jams, the creation of anti-games. These projects resist traditional interpretations of play, existing as thought experiments, critiques of the industry, or explorations of alternative forms of engagement. By refusing play, anti-games provoke emotional responses through their subversion and muddying of gamic forms. This playful anti-play challenges designers and would-be players alike to confront their own desires and anxieties around games and game markets. Such anti-game jams blur the line between game and art object and question the economic structures surrounding game creation. Ultimately, anti-game jamming represents a potent form of artistic and social critique within the digital game landscape. Now, I'm going to pivot here to the second part of this study. Over the last decade, several design communities have emerged around independently created fantasy consoles, such as Pico 8, Bitsy, Meg4, Voxatron, and dozens of others. Fantasy consoles are machine emulators in that they simulate hardware limitations through software that do not imitate extant hardware systems, but rather emulate hypothetical console hardware. Fantasy consoles represent a broad reinterpretation of retro console gaming and present creative challenges for designers and players who must work within or hack and modify the arbitrary limitations of these systems. One of the most popular fantasy consoles, Pico 8, developed by Joseph White and released in 2015, requires developers to adhere to strict limitations for computing power, sprite size, and sound channels. Pico 8 invokes old microcomputers, from its command line interface to its limited resources, and this inspires established and novice game designers alike. Pico 8's website answers the question, what is a fantasy console? With, a fantasy console is like a regular console, but without the inconvenience of actual hardware. In this sense, fantasy console developers like Joseph White root their project in speculative design practice. The console is fantastic, ostensibly both wondrous and intangible. But this definition is really murky. These murky definitions reveal several key values endemic to fantasy console subcultures, namely a discursive distance and at times aversion to physical hardware, disinterest in proprietary game engines and tools for making, and a complex relationship to established communities for hacking, modding, and fangaming commercial games. Now, I don't have time to get into all the things I'm thinking about with these two research subjects, but I want to tease out the big arguments that I'm ultimately making about these speculative game design practices. The first thing is that there is a direct linkage, I argue, between how speculative game designers are disentangling from game industries now and long-standing legacies of shareware, zine culture, and development as community. Early text-adventure video games were published to online forums on ARPANET and circulated among networked users interested in hypertext story games. And because these games emerged before personalized computers ushered in a wave of standardization, the act of downloading and running such games often involved significant modification and setup. Because there existed no premise of standardization to run a game, at all was to emulate it, to rewrite the game's code, recompile, and execute it. To run a game meant rebuilding it. To play was also to tinker. And anti-game jams on itch extend these historic zine movements. Soliciting games that devour other games, playtests and works in progress, experimental parodies, and more, these jams represent a coming together of creative practitioners centered on making and breaking at once. Uninterested in the verity of finished products, anti-game jams center the processes of artists, encouraging reckless creation and submission. Fantasy console communities similarly pay homage to the traditions of play as emulation in zine culture. After all, Pico 8 fanzines bear striking resemblance to early hobbyist magazines, all the way down to printing line-by-line code for projects. Echoing the practices of early text-adventure games circulated on ARPANET and the mimeographed zines of role-playing enthusiasts, speculative game design movements celebrate the act of creation and see games as malleable experiences to be tinkered with, reimagined, and shared. Anti-games also exist in defiance of the shovelware paranoia that became prominent following the mid-2010s so-called indie-pocalypse. Anti-games respond to the prescriptive gavels of game markets, which would delineate what games are real and which are shovelware, by soliciting and promoting games that are not games, games that are other things, and exploring what play art might look like beyond industry and market definitions. In a time of alleged market saturation, mass layoffs, and escalating precarity for game developers, anti-game jammers celebrate opportunities to come together and share creative incitements without regard for the metrics of success or restrictions imposed by game markets. It is likewise worth positioning fantasy consoles as emulators within a creative ecology of hacking, modding, and building fan games. Fantasy consoles collapse clear genealogies of technology. How can one emulate a fantasy system that never existed? The use of fantasy in fantasy console is deployed by community members and developers rhetorically to vacillate the proximity of fantasy consoles to commodified hardware systems. While neither Bitsy nor Pico 8 emulate commercial hardware, and even take care to distance themselves from proprietary systems, this aversion to branded content does not extend to developers who create games for these platforms. It's worth noting, for example, that an overwhelming majority of the most popular games on itch made with Pico 8 are demakes of known game franchises and titles. Pico 8's tagline for fantasy consoles, like a regular console but without the inconvenience of actual hardware, illustrates the speculative project of fantasy console developers. The inconvenience here is not merely material, but reflects an evasion of commodification and potential legal implication. In a time when game publishers have cracked down on emulated games and developers through legal strong-arming, fantasy console communities remain, at present, a relatively safe space for playing and making with emulation, retro fangaming, and demakes. Yet this position is precarious, and so developers and enthusiasts regularly insist that these consoles and their projects are imagined, unreal, or otherwise speculative. So to wrap up, this shift towards the speculative comes amid a time of tremendous upheaval in mainstream game development, colored by sustained tension between makers and publishers looking to further commodify tools. As game companies grow in scope, financial reach, and cultural power, they have turned towards increasingly aggressive anti-developer, anti-player measures that have left a psychic scar on development communities. Yet speculative game design communities have emerged in response to these very conditions. Speculative game design is rooted in a new creative imaginary, one that destabilizes the standard metagame and threatens corporate taxonomies of original, valuable, and approved ways to play. Game designers produce unplayable anti-games that refuse ludic engagement, and such experimental works convey affective gravity and artistic intention as they defy commodification and even use. Speculative design practices allow developers to envision and participate in a post-capitalist imaginary of hardware, software, and play. An imaginary where the tools belong to the makers and the cultural values of game markets lose their hold. Importantly, anti-game jamming and fantasy console development are not salvational practices. They emerge from the ephemeral creative scenes built by largely unremunerated community members and their labor. Yet these practices illuminate how designers continue to organize creative work outside industry contexts, around communally negotiated values of accessibility, user ownership, artistic process, and unencumbered participation. Speculative game design practices are indeed fantastic and anti-gamic, and therein lies their potential as a means of radical making. Hello again. Thanks so much for listening. You can download the full paper from the proceedings at the QR code here. And if you're interested in any of this and would love to chat, email and my Discord is on the screen. I'm chronically online. I'm also excited to chat with y'all and my fellow panelists at the Q&A, provided I remember to set my alarm correctly. But hopefully see you in just a few minutes. Bye.